we should not be hesitating. And unfortunately, I hear people say, well, they might use a nuclear weapon because Crimea is so important for the reasons that you just gave. They're not entitled to any sort of empire.
Our guest this week on The Edge is retired General Ben Hodges, and I've known General Hodges since the Iraq War when he was there and I was a producer for CBS News. Following that conflict, he'd rise through the ranks and ultimately became commander of all land forces for NATO in Europe. After his retirement, he has now been a well-respected commentator and an outspoken supporter for Ukraine. As such, his time is quite limited, so we're lucky to have him and any time he can spare. So, General, thanks you for very much for coming and for speaking to us. You're our first remote guest. It looks like we're about to enter a new stage of the war. We've got the 6.1 billion now released. We've got I don't talk about kind of like news of the day stuff, but just recently we've had this decision to allow Western ammunition to be fired on Russian territory. And of course, imminently, we're going to get the F-16s. It seems we're about to enter into a new stage of the war. I wonder if you could touch on that for us.
So obviously, there are several things you just mentioned that are encouraging. Even if long overdue, nonetheless, it's positive direction. The fact that there's still uncertainty, or that there was even a policy that said Ukraine cannot use weapons across the border, even though you can see where the enemy is massing, you can see from which they are sustaining their operations, you can see from where they are launching attacks that kill innocent people, that we had somehow put restrictions on that. This is a reflection of, for me, what is the biggest problem is that the United States, Germany, and some of the other Western European countries and Canada have not even committed to Ukraine winning. I mean, the president has not even said, we want Ukraine to win. It's in our interest that Ukraine wins. And so when you do not have a clearly defined objective, it's difficult to come up with to develop good policy. So that's why you have incremental decision-making, bad policy. So yes, all positive things, but even today, I could not tell you with certainty exactly what the U.S. policy is about firing at legitimate targets across the border.
That leads me to another pertinent question in that, for Ukrainians, this is an existential threat, 100% existential threat. And, they're not going to stop fighting. So even if there was a catastrophic loss in the field for conventional Ukrainian armed forces because of maybe this lack of international support, they would still continue to fight. We would then, even if there was a massive rout of Ukrainian forces, which ain't going to happen, but let's say in a worst case scenario, some total rout happens, there would still be partisan warfare. There would still be an insurgency. You and I both spent time in Iraq. We know what an insurgency looks like. So the only question is how many Ukrainians are going to die in the fight for their liberation. Are we really going to stop supporting them and watch from the sidelines? Those are our really two options as far as I'm concerned. I wonder if you could touch on that.
Well, look, this year is every year in a war is important, but when I think about this year, this is the year when Ukrainians have stopped the Russians. Okay, of course, none of us were happy to see we were disappointed to see last year's counteroffensive for a variety of reasons, mostly not Ukrainian fault. That it didn't go as much as we wanted, and then our hesitation and months of delay of getting what was needed, plus European countries also did not step forward and fill in that gap. Even with that, Russia was not able to exploit the opportunity that they had. I don't think that they have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. There's not going to be this rout sort of scenario that you suggest even if. So I think that the Russians are probably on a path to culminate themselves by the end of next year. Yes, they have lots of people. They don't care how many casualties they have. Um, but if we could isolate them economically from what they get from China, for example, and Iran, and this is entirely doable if we put our mind to it, I think you're going to see things change dramatically next year. This is assuming that Ukraine addresses its own challenges in terms of, do you have enough units to do what needs to be done? I think of this year as a year of industrial competition, where we are finally starting to see some momentum on delivering ammunition, for example. I think I remain very optimistic about what this is going to look like by the end of this year.
Yeah, speaking briefly with our limited time about the mobilization issue, we've seen a lot of this video, and there's a large propaganda push clearly from the Russian side about criticizing mobilization. We've seen these videos come out like force people into vans and stuff like that. And yet at the same time, from being on the ground here in Ukraine, for every one of those videos I see, I know hundreds of people that are going and doing, or thousands really, presumably, but from my personal experience, hundreds, who are going to the mobilization stations and doing the proper registration. What are you seeing when it comes to this new mobilization law? Why that's so important? And then this kind of like clear attempt by Moscow to push this narrative that Ukrainians don't want to fight.
Yeah, I think that there is some confusion in the language about mobilization versus conscription versus professional, age limits. I've spoken extensively with a dear Ukrainian friend who serves today in the armed forces, and he seemed more confident than what it sounds like on the outside about, do they have enough people, or will they get enough people that they need? Certainly, there's no doubt that units you need to have units so that you can do a rotation to allow people to reconstitute, to train, and I think more investment in the actual training apparatus, the infrastructure required, is something that's important. When I think of in World War II, this notion that the U.S. just mobilized and grew to 12 million people, there was training going on all the time until and through the end of the war. And I think that kind of support for Ukraine is just as important as providing ammunition.
I've heard you talk about the way to resolve this war is through Crimea, that's kind of the linchpin of this conflict. And I agree with you there. It's clear that Moscow and Russia have a well-earned reputation for being able to absorb casualties. My perception on that is it's not the body count that's going to cause crisis in Russia, but rather their loss of empire. I mean, this is, going back in Russian history, Peter the Great says you got to have a great naval power. And Russia has always aspired to a warm water port ever since. Catherine the Great takes this territory in the great kind of expansion of empire, which they so tie their sense of self because she came down here as the Ottomans withdrew. And then thirdly, it's their concept of the third Rome. They envision themselves as Moscow being the third Rome. And for that, you need access to the Med. You need, this kind of idyllic. If you watch these old Soviet movies of the 70s and 80s, General, you'll see this whole motif of kind of like, our great kind of empire by the sea sort of thing. So my perception of the Russians, having lived there and studied this region for so long, is that it's not a body count that may or may not do it, but rather a threat to their sense of identity as empire, which Crimea is essential to. Could you talk a little bit about this? I mean, we have to answer to an electorate. So when body bags start coming home in a democracy, there's a response. Russia doesn't look at it that way, in my perception. It's not the body bags coming back. It's if they're humiliated yet again on the world stage by losing territory. Does that kind of gel with your perception of why Crimea is so important? And then maybe the military aspect, obviously, as well.
I don't disagree with what you just said. but I would say that the casualties, where those casualties come from, will matter. I mean, I think there's a reason that the Kremlin has avoided heavily recruiting from the St. Petersburg and Moscow area. So the fact that 500,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or lost, that they come from out in the hinterland somewhere, that doesn't bother anybody in Moscow or St. Petersburg. When they start having funerals in those cities, then I think that will be a different impact domestically. And also, if we could really fully apply the maximum pressure economically, so that the oligarchs, the people surrounding Putin, really begin to feel it, and they can't hide their money and their kids can no longer go to school in London or Switzerland or whatever, that will begin to have an impact. But I like your idea about the sense of empire. Now, of course, we should not be hesitating. And unfortunately, I hear people say, well, they might use a nuclear weapon because Crimea is so important for the reasons that you just gave. They're not entitled to any sort of empire. And I think from a practical standpoint, not only will liberating Crimea make it very difficult for Russia to continue launching attacks against Ukraine, particularly along the coast, it will make it very difficult for them to continue to disrupt Ukrainian grain exports and to create problems in the Western Black Sea. And then from a post-conflict standpoint, the big investors are not going to invest a lot of money into Ukraine's reconstruction as long as Russia controls Crimea, blocks access up into Azov Sea, all of these things. So I think Ukraine is well on the way to eventually liberating Crimea. Now that they have more long-range precision weapons, they can make Crimea uninhabitable or unusable for Russian Army, Navy, and Air Force. And they're isolating it. That big bridge is going to come down when the Ukrainians are ready for it to come down, and they'll pick the right time. So I think we can expect that to happen, if not the end of this year, then early into next year. That would be my guess.
And they scream blood. We talked about this at the beginning, but I don't want to touch on it briefly again, because Moscow has clearly said that they are deeply concerned about the F-16, and they made all these overtures about this being a nuclear capable platform, and they've always threatened. They always say saber rattle with their nukes. What can we reasonably actually expect from the F-16s? We saw the HIMARS making a significant difference. We saw the armor. When that started flowing in, made a pretty big difference. I mean, I love Mia Bradley, but how significant will it be when the F-16s take to the air, do you think?
I think people should appreciate, like you do, that the F-16 is a great aircraft. It has a lot of capability, but nothing's magic about it, just like nothing's magic about any other weapon system out there. It's how they are employed. What makes the U.S. Air Force so good is not because of the great airplanes, but it's because of the training, the culture, all the stuff that they do that goes into the operation to employ that platform. Everything from suppression of enemy air defense to being prepared to go in and rescue pilots to the maintenance, the refueling, all of this stuff that allows the U.S. to have such air power. So I think that we want to make sure that, and actually I'm very confident that the Ukrainians are going to do this, that they will do this in such a way that they build up their own confidence and that they learn without getting a bunch of aircraft shot down, the first time they go out. Because they will lose some. I mean, it's inevitable that they will lose some. Now, how many and how and where, the key will be how quickly are they able to adapt as they gain experience using it, just like they did with every other weapon system that we provided. This is not about can they learn fast enough. I mean, there's nobody, I've never met anybody from any country that learns faster than Ukrainians on how to use or adapt new technology. That's unquestioned. But having to build up the expertise on how to employ the aircraft, and there's a big difference between flying an aircraft and fighting an aircraft as part of an operation. And of course, everyone is anxious. When are they coming? When are they coming? We're not entitled to know. I mean, the ministry is not going to announce, okay, everybody get ready. Tomorrow is a big day, the F-16. So I think we'll start seeing effects over time when the Ukrainians are ready.
How do you think generally NATO has performed? As a former commander within NATO, how has NATO's reaction to Russia's invasion of if you gave it a scorecard, what would it be?
Well, very good. In terms of, are we learning? Are we paying attention to what we're seeing? Is NATO making the necessary adjustments? And I would think that the answer to that would be a resounding yes. I mean, not only has the alliance grown with two more countries that made NATO better the day they joined, Finland and Sweden, but also the degree of seriousness and urgency that I see in training exercises now, in defense investments and modernization efforts, what each of the nations are doing. We still have significant challenges. There's not enough air and missile defense. I mean, all you got to do is look at what the Russians do against Ukrainian cities. Could we knock down as many missiles and drones as the Ukrainians are doing? I don't know that we're ready to do that yet, but we'll have to be ready to do that. The ammunition issues, that's well known, well documented, and at least now there's an awareness across the alliance that we have got to kickstart our defense industry to get that going again. It's not something you can just turn on like a light switch. But the importance of readiness of women and men who are properly trained and disciplined that can use the technology that we have, I've been impressed with that.
Yeah, well, as somebody who lives under the protection of a Patriot system here in Kiev, I can tell you, having seen it in action, it's a blessing. So we need to get a lot more of those, and not just here in Kiev. We need them in Odessa. We need them in Kharkiv. We need them out along the front line. So, what has been frustrating from our perspective on the ground here in Ukraine, General, is the drip, drip, drip aspect of aid to Ukraine. What is that? Help me explain to my Ukrainian friends that I interact with on the daily. Why is it? It's like pulling teeth with the West. Where does that come from?
It comes from not having a clearly defined objective. I mean, if the administration was to say, and if the Germans were to say, we recognize it is in our strategic interest that Ukraine defeats Russia, and we're going to do everything necessary to help them do that, then you would not have drip, drip. You would see the United States, Germany, other countries getting serious about providing what's needed to win. Instead, we don't have a clearly defined end state, and that's why you end up with this ridiculous, we're with you for as long as it takes, which is a totally empty statement. So there is a very, very high degree of self-deterrence, of the focus is all about escalation management. And somehow that Russia can be controlled like a rheostat on your heater. And that's why you have this drip, 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 and it's maddening, and it's so unnecessary. But the Russians, of course, they see that, and this is all about, the administration is excessively, overly concerned that Russia might actually use a nuclear weapon, and so it drives everything. And this is where I would encourage my Ukrainian friends, figure out how in your messaging to allay the fears that the administration has. I mean, explain what it means. If Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine, what would Ukraine's response be? What would that look like? What are they so effing concerned about? And I think, that would help. I live here in Germany, and, Germans are very concerned. The chance of Russia using a nuclear weapon against Germany is about zero, but yet they act like if they provide Taurus, Berlin's going to be flattened. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know where this kind of defeatism and skepticism comes from, and then they set themselves up for defeat by this fear of the Kremlin and its nuclear saber rattling.
No,
So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
exactly.
Where does I mean, obviously there's the nukes, but aside from that, it seems to be more intrinsic that there's this fear of the great big bear. Where does this defeatism come from?
Well, unfortunately, most of the people that are in and by the way, I want to be very clear. The Biden administration has done a good job on so much of this, keeping 50 nations together. I'm sure Putin never imagined this, and it's a million times better than it would be if there was a Trump administration. So I want to be clear about that.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed 100%.
But having said that, all the Russia experts, for people who are listening, I just did my air quote, Russia experts who were advising the Biden administration are the same ones that advised the Obama administration. And so this naivety and unwillingness to confront Russia as what it is, a bully, a country that, yes, they have famous people like Dostoevsky and, famous musicians, but they also are a nation of butchers and thugs that don't care about human life and don't have any respect for international law. I think that the experts that are there advising are like, oh, Russia's this great country. We got to respect them. If Putin looks like he's going to fall out of power, they're going to use nuclear weapons. And we're talking about a country. Yes, they have thousands of nuclear weapons, and they don't care how many innocent people they kill. But where would they use a nuclear weapon? I mean, what would they do with it? If you start asking those questions, there's zero benefit for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. But yet people...
the second they use, you can't unring that bell. Once they use it, there's a no-fly zone. There's all sorts of things that we can do.
The president did say there would be catastrophic consequences if they used it. The Chinese have said, do not do it. The Chinese will not be happy if Russia decides to do that. And I think this is important. And, every time Medvedev gets out there and talks about we need to nuke London or whatever, I mean, that, unfortunately, there are smart people that believe that. And that, I think this is why the administration seems so reluctant to go all in and help Ukraine win.
Yeah, and the fact that the Russians know it. I mean, they obviously every time things seem to be taking a sour turn for them, they pull out the Trump card, no pun intended there, but with their nukes. And then we dance to their tune. I mean, at what point do we, I'm going to be a little bit rude here, pardon me, General, you're far more careful in your language, but I'll say it, shit or get off the pot. I mean, are we always going to be afraid of a thug with a nuke? And then what message does that send to the rest of the world that, save if you have a nuke, you're going to get pushed around? I mean, what is this all boil right down to?
That is a terrible message that Iran, North Korea, and other countries that have a nuke or want a nuke can see that the United States will deter itself just because Russia threatens to move a tactical nuclear weapon into Belarus, for example. That people, we constantly overreact to that, as do the Germans. And so this is where, strong positive leadership is really what's needed to clearly state what our objectives are and to talk plainly to our own population. Don't say things like, we want to avoid escalation. Say, we're going to make sure that Russia knows that they cannot use a nuclear weapon. And we have thousands of nuclear weapons too. If they do it, they're going to suffer catastrophic consequences. We haven't even tried yet, Phil, to help Ukraine win. I mean, we actually haven't even tried. There's so many holes in the sanctions with this. I mean, more than 2 years, F-16s still not in the skies yet. We haven't provided endless amounts of ammunition. We're just really not fully engaged in this. And when we are, then it's going to be over. Russia has the economy of my home state of Florida, maybe. Okay, maybe. And we have got to use all of our advantages. And this is important in a broader strategic sense. If if you think help Ukraine defeat Russia, that will isolate Iran, which is Russia is Iran's closest ally. Iran is Russia's closest ally. So if you defeat Russia, Iran becomes isolated. They're less able to support the Houthis and the Hamas and the Hezbollah. And then the Chinese will look at this and say, wow, they're serious. The West is actually serious about all the things that we say are important. Right now, I don't think that they think we're really serious.
Why is it so important for us to defend militarily this fledgling democracy called Ukraine that is basically, as a fellow American, seeking the same thing that we sought in 1776 was liberation from an empire, a pretty cruel one at the time. We had an ocean between our imperial masters and us. Why is it, as a former colony and as an American who wants, who would like to see the American experiment and project, prosper, why is it important for the West and Americans in particular to support Ukraine?
So there's three reasons that Ukraine defeating Russia is in our strategic interest. Number one, if you don't want to have NATO get into a direct conflict with Russia, then help Ukraine defeat Russia in Ukraine. And it could have happened last year if we had put our shoulder to the wheel. Okay, it's still very, very possible. But if Ukraine fails, you have a much greater chance of NATO being directly involved in a conflict, that including the United States. Plus, the second reason, of course, is the economic reasons. Millions more Ukrainian refugees will be pouring into Europe. A continued disruption of food supplies and energy supplies. All of these things are bad for America's economy because Europe is our most important and largest economic partner. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, Europe is the biggest trading partner to the United States, bigger than China, bigger than anybody, bigger than Mexico, Canada, etc. So economically, it's bad for us. And then the third reason why this really matters, of course, is again, China. The Chinese will not be impressed with anything we say about sovereignty or freedom of navigation or respect for international law if they see that we can't and are not willing to do what's necessary to help defeat Russia, where all those things are at stake. That's why it matters to us. And then from a practical standpoint, NATO will get better the second that Ukraine becomes a member of the alliance. You got the most experienced, most effective land force on the continent of Europe right now is Ukrainians. Once they become a member of the alliance, the last thing that Russia will do is want to attack Ukraine.
And just to follow up briefly, if you'll allow me, I mean, that point you make about dominance of Europe and our good partners and allies in Europe, it doesn't have to be tanks rolling down Warsaw, the streets of Warsaw, or Russian soldiers on Piccadilly. An emboldened, empowered Russia, dominant of Europe, is counterproductive to certainly American interests, but just Western interests in general. It doesn't have to be a military dominance that Moscow will exert if it wins here in Ukraine. That's my little 2 cents.
Yeah, well, they're at war now. I mean, we're at war mindset already. Disinformation.
They do.
Criminal activity. Almost every week you can see video of some Russian tourists beating up people. There was one yesterday in Prague where there's a Ukrainian advocacy group out there, and you've got these thugs who are happy to cheer for Russia. Of course, they're enjoying being over in Europe. This is what we're going to be dealing with until they are absolutely crushed.
Yeah, and that imperial mindset has to be driven from them, as Professor Snyder over at Yale is so wont to say. I could talk to you for so much longer, but I know your time is limited. I appreciate the time that you have granted us, and I hope you'll come back soon. I hope I haven't wasted your time because I know we had some technical difficulties there, but I'll make it work. We'll put it out there, General, because I think what you say, and you've been a great friend to Ukraine, and those of us on the ground here, both internationals here supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians themselves, appreciate your help. I know that for a fact.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, and I would love to come back. I
I'd love
think,
to do a much longer one, but I know you got to run, but let me just I'll wrap it up with probably the most important question I'm going to ask you, or at least one of the most important ones. What's your prognosis? Looking in the crystal ball. Everybody hates this question. I hate this question when it gets posed to me, but I got to ask it. Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Looking down the line, where do you think this thing is going?
well, there's no doubt, zero doubt in my mind, and I wouldn't say this if I didn't believe it, that Ukraine is going to defeat Russia. Of course, the amount of time it takes depends a lot on the United States and Germany and UK and France. Do we commit to helping them win? If we don't, then it drags on a lot longer. But I think when I look at what Russia has done to put themselves where they are now, they're going to have to pay. They're going to pay the price for that here by the end of next year. Economically, um, this is what they're doing now is not sustainable. And I think at some point, from an economic industrial standpoint, that those chickens are going to come home to roost. And then when I think about what I see, Ukrainians, the resilience of the people as well as the military, um, and the innovation. I mean, I imagine there are people in the Kremlin on the Russian general staff that are wondering, like, what is General Budanov going to do to us next? I mean, it is so impressive the way Ukraine is able to strike radar, oil and gas infrastructure, one of Putin's houses, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away. I mean, nothing is safe. And this what you addressed earlier, which I agree, this sense of invincibility of the Russians, of empire. Here you've got Ukraine is able to strike when and where they want to at targets that I'm sure the Russians thought were safe. And this is what I think the Ukrainian special forces, intelligence services, General Budanov and his team have gotten inside the head of the Russians. And the Russians are going to have to start spreading out their air defense to protect things they thought they would never have to. So that's part of what gives me optimism. And then finally, the great Black Sea Fleet. You know, a third of it's underwater, the rest of it is retreating. And Ukraine does not even have a navy in the traditional sense of the word. The great Russian Air Force, huge numerical advantage, failed job one, which is establish air superiority, and they failed job two, which is interdict the lines of communication. So I don't understand the doomers walking around like, oh my God, Ukraine's got to negotiate. No, let's get serious about helping them win, and this thing will be over.
Yeah, I know I got to let you go, but I got to mention a couple of things in response to that. One, the Black Sea Fleet is one of their only four fleets. They've got their Arctic, they got the Baltic, which is now bottled in because of the change in NATO. They've got their Pacific Fleet, which is hampered because the support line going through Siberia is damn near impossible. And they're losing the Black Sea. This is the dream of Peter being destroyed before our eyes. No Russian leader survives that. Vladimir Putin is living on borrowed time. I will stand by that, and I appreciate you mentioning that. And the whole combined arms thing, the fact that you and look, I've never worn the uniform, but I'm an old war dog. I've been through a few conflicts myself, and I've had the privilege of being embedded with NATO forces. The fact that the Russians don't have air superiority this far into the war is astounding to me, and they're about to get the F-16s here. So all of this, I love the way you put it. I appreciate your time so much. I could ask you so many more things, but we'll have to hang it up here, and we'll pick it up another time. Trust me, you're absolutely 100% right about the strength and the ability and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. I see it on the daily here. People ask me, am I not afraid to be here? I'm not a fool. Of course, I'm conscious of the threat that is here, but it is a privilege and an honor to bear witness to the strength and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Obviously come on over anytime. I know you got a busy summer, but next time you're in Kiev, we'd love to have you in studio. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but these people, it's my privilege. I'm the lucky one to be here watching
Yeah,
this. You
yeah.
know that it's an amazing country, and maybe it renews a little bit of our understanding of why democracy and things like the rule of law and independence and sovereignty are so important. Maybe something Americans need to remember every now and again. General Ben Hodges, thank you for spending your time with us here on the Edge. We'll have you back anytime, and hopefully someday here in studio. Slava Ukraini.
Heroam Slava. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, General.